The Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest in the world, and we just happen to live in them. One thing we can tell you, there are ghosts in the mountains.
Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Ghosts in the Mountains. I am your host, Caleb Hanks, and I am always inevitably, he is inevitable, joined by the great, the non-doctor, the non-captain, Dr. Captain Austin Burgalicious Burgess.
Oh, that's a new one.
Brother, how are you this evening?
I am doing quite well this evening. How are you doing, buddy?
Well, my man, I am probably doing a lot better than somebody else that I know and love dearly, who is joining us in the studio tonight out of the graciousness of his heart. Mr. Micah Hanks is joining us tonight. Micah, how the heck are ya?
I am splendid, of course.
Indeed. Well, Micah literally just flew in. Micah lives on a damn airplane. And he's been so kind to come right from the airport and come join us on the podcast. So, Micah, seriously, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. I mean, you know, on the eve of the wedding, which one day will soon be the date of the anniversary of the burglar.
Here we go. Yeah, we told our listeners that I already got married because by the time that episode comes out, will be right after the wedding. But, you know, you get the kind of cadence of our recording with that. So technically, I'm getting married in a couple days.
Doesn't matter. I mean, you know, when you're a space-time doctor, everything gets wibbly-wobbly. Time doesn't really matter.
That is true. That's a good introduction for this episode, right?
Yeah. Time to me looks more like a pretzel than it does a pole or a staff. You see?
I like the analogy.
It's just simple.
I don't know if I follow, but I like it.
Time is rolled and time is gold. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us for another wild and crazy episode. You know it's going to be a wild and crazy one with Micah on. So I wanted to kind of describe this episode as episode 43/episode 0, because here we are in our 40s of episodes, and some of us aging rapidly towards that inevitability as well. But we've done all these episodes on this podcast about ghosts, but I don't think we've ever taken the time to just sit back and really take a look at this whole thing and go, hey, seriously, what the hell is a ghost? What could these things be? What are these apparitions that we report so many stories about?
Right. I think we've thrown out a few speculative theories here and there when they kind of coincide with the topic and episode, but I think it'd be a good chance to do a real deep dive collection on all those.
We are going to not only dive deep, we are going to go into some of the most ancient tomes that we could find. And by that, I mean, I had to ask Micah, hey, what the hell is a ghost? And, well, he was kind enough to tell us that, you know, he'd spent a little bit of time looking into this stuff. I've spent a little bit of time looking into this stuff. I know Austin spent a little bit of time looking into this stuff. But we're going to kind of pool our knowledge tonight and look at some of the information that has been put together and documented by people that were fascinated by this exact same question back in the day, you know, even as far back as the 1800s and probably beyond there from everything that I understand that Mike has been looking into. So let me just kind of start out with this portion of it. Number one, ever since we kind of started looking into this stuff and spooky season hits, I'm just kind of loading in all of this information into my brain, watching a lot of programs about reported hauntings, experiences that a lot of people have had. Anytime I see a ghost story on, like a Netflix show or something like that, 9 times out of 10, I'm going on Google and I'm looking stuff up, like how much of these stories are actually, being portrayed accurately by the people that experience them and not stories that are being influenced by story writers, scripted stuff, people that are bringing in actors into certain things. Because, you know, there's some what they call pseudo-documentary content out there that it can seem very much like these are real stories, but at the end of the day, you find out, some of the stuff is a little bit more scripted than they actually let on, which is really disappointing because there's a lot of shows on Netflix that do it really well, like make some really cool stuff. But there's been a few that I've seen recently and just some stories that I've heard over the years that have really, really intrigued me because I remember, and Micah, I don't know if you remember what this program was back in the day, but I feel like it was not maybe In Search Of. I think it was one of those shows in the 90s that was a bit like this. But I always remember there being this video of this guy, and he's kind of on, he's the father of a family, and he's on some kind of talk show, and they're talking about this haunting that has just been plaguing their family.
Sightings.
You think it was on Sightings? He's talking about this haunting that's just been plaguing his family forever. And the dude, I couldn't find the clip when I was looking for it. But as he's sitting there on this talk show, he goes, oh gosh, like, I think something's actually like hurting me right now. And he spins around and you start to see physical bloody scratch marks start to manifest on his back. Now, I'm completely fine with the idea that, okay, this was just some sort of strange movie magic, some sort of made for TV BS, or some sort of effect that they did to drum up ratings. Completely fine with this idea. However, this is not the only instance that I've seen stories where people are depicting this exact same thing. I've actually heard an overwhelming number of ghost encounters where people say, something touched me, something pushed me, something scratched me. It's not always just the typical cold spots. This is kind of why I started thinking about, okay, some people can just look at this report of a ghost scratched me and left physical scratch marks on my body, and that's just what ghosts do. That's just what it is. To me, the implication is a lot more massive, that whatever these things are can somehow interact with our, I'll just say, dimension. Physically.
Yeah.
And as far as we can perceive, these entities have supernatural abilities. I've just been completely puzzled by this because I've seen a lot of stories in recent times where these people that are being interviewed and telling their encounters of this, they don't seem to be lying. They don't seem to be completely full of crap. In some instances, there's images of these scratch marks. Obviously, anybody could scratch themselves and say that it was a ghost. But this is kind of end game of where I want to take this. Depending on what a ghostly entity is, how does it have the ability to do these things? How does it have the ability to come into our realm and actually physically manifest something towards us in which we cannot reciprocate towards them? So I get to talking about this with the bro a couple days ago, and that's kind of why we had the idea to have Micah on tonight and talk about some of this stuff. Micah, I know that, back in the days when you were doing the Grayling Report podcast, I think you did, a lot more investigation about, ghost phenomenon. Obviously, you and I got our start in all this stuff being ghost hunters, which is the dumbest name of all time. Paranormal investigators, I'm much more into that. I bet you have probably asked yourself the very same questions. And at the end of the day, it really does come down to, do we believe the people that are telling us that this is what they experienced? I mean, that is really the crux of the whole thing. So, Micah, I think over the years, you've probably heard plenty of information that would make you go, okay, well, this doesn't seem like it's just one individual that is experiencing some sort of psychosis. There's been multiple people that have experienced these things. So I'm going to let you kind of go where you want. I know I've put out a lot of questions right there, but as far as your thought process and the things that you've learned and read over the years, where does your mind go when you are posed with the question, what is a ghost?
Well, I mean, for me personally, I'll just say this. Yes, when I was younger, I was interested in paranormal investigation, searching for evidence of ghosts, spirits, and the afterlife. And doing that is partly what drove me towards skepticism.
Yeah, sure.
And one of the reasons why is because when you begin to spend time in the field, you begin to find that there are a lot of factors that influence people's interest in and belief in ghosts. And by the way, I'm not going to be the skeptic here saying ghosts don't exist. I'm going to be the person who I think from a balanced perspective will try to encourage healthy skepticism and also allow for belief where warranted, but that should be based on evidence, despite what anybody on Wikipedia might say about me, by the way. Now, that all said, I think that, again, if you have as your premise, your question is, are there ghosts and how do they influence us? And how could they, for instance, leave scars or marks on a person? I would take 2 steps further back than that.
I totally hear you. And I will say I probably should have led with also the other side of that being, do you think that it is completely in our own minds and all of this is a manifestation of the human psyche?
Well, maybe. Again, where I think I was going with that was stepping back. My fundamental questions, looking at, the idea of ghosts would be, are there ghosts? What is that? And what kinds of factors can we attribute to, the common conception or definition that we have for what a ghost is supposed to be versus things that people associate with them, but which can be grouped better in another category.
Sure.
For instance, seriously, as I was sitting there in the airport, I was taking some notes earlier, and I would say objects moving on their own, strange noises, cold spots that people talk about, inside a quote-unquote haunted house. And actually, I would put that one on the list, the idea that there can be a manifestation of phenomena that singularly occurs in a certain home, residence, old building, location.
Or attached to an object.
All these kinds of things. Disembodied voices. These are the kinds of things that I would say my first inclination is to think that those are phenomena that very likely are, not necessarily always, but very likely in most cases are attributable to more mundane things.
Yeah.
So how do they become associated with ghosts? Well, naturally, humans, and you got to think about this too. Humans have evolved in order to survive, to be wary of things happening in our environment. We are very cautious when we're walking down a dark, path at night and we hear something off in the bushes. We didn't evolve to ignore the sound of something over in the bushes. That didn't help us survive. We evolved to be concerned when we hear a noise and we can't attribute that to anything. And the way that our psychology works, again, there are a lot of different factors, but I think that coming down to a pretty fundamental evolutionary perspective on this, we perceive these stimuli as potentially being threatening when we can't attribute it to something that we can directly identify because that helped us survive. Yeah. Oh, is there a tiger in the bushes that's about to leap out and eat me?
Probably not in New England where most of the hauntings happen.
But of course not. But here's the point. The important point is that our fundamental, biological system for detecting threats in the environment is exactly the same as it was for early humans back in the day when we didn't have technology, we had no written language.
Yeah.
When Neanderthal and Denisovans still walked the earth, early modern humans in that period, we could just take this back to the Pleistocene, the last ice age, we had the same fundamental operating system that we have today. So you're right. No, there aren't lions that are going to jump out of a brush and bite somebody in England. But when somebody experiences a haunting in England and they say, there was a cold breeze coming through the house, we could hear strange sounds. We got the feeling that there was something that was following us or watching us. You could also say all those things happen frequently to people when they're walking down a dark country road at night, and they get wary of those phenomena because we have evolved to sense those things and go, okay, is something about to hurt me? So that's what the first approach I always take. It's like, okay, are there things that we are identifying as ghostly manifestations that are a result of how our operating system interprets the environment? And are we assigning agency to it?
Right.
And rather than the caveman or woman, who thousands of years ago would say, am I about to be eaten? In our, society today, we have the benefit of being able to say, is there a ghost in my house? Now, then there's the other side of it, and these are the much rarer, the residuum. And this is the same like when it comes to UFOs and things like this. I get reports from people constantly. I've seen a UFO. Had a wonderful report sent to me the other night about a family that had this great experience watching UFOs, kind of a fleet of UFOs that would show up and then disappear, and they watched them over their backyard all night. And they said, we know these weren't satellites because they would fly and then they would all disappear in a certain place in the sky.
That old humdrum flap.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and people will see things like this and they'll interpret it as being, well, we know they weren't satellites because they were disappearing into a little spot in the sky. And so maybe there was a mothership that they were flying into. Maybe there was a wormhole or a portal.
So their mind's filling in the blanks without all the information there.
Yep.
And that's another thing. That's a really good point right there, Austin, because this is, you should write. You should be like a science
are you a writer?
Yeah, maybe I should consider that career.
Yeah, I mean, your mind fills in the blanks. That's exactly what our minds do when we don't have a full data set. Now, what's really happening is they are watching satellites. They're being illuminated by the sun directly over the horizon. They're entering Earth's shadow, and that's why they're disappearing. They're just passing into the shadow of the Earth. But again, you're looking at things you can't explain, and you begin filling in those gaps, and you start making assumptions. That is also how our minds work. Now, in those much rarer cases, somebody will be like, no, there was a saucer hanging there. It had a yellow light, a green light, and a purple light. It hung there. It began flashing. We were 35 feet away from it, and we saw a porthole open and a little face pop out. I mean, those are the much rarer reports. Just like with UFOs, in the realm of ghosts, poltergeists, and spirit phenomena, much rarer are those cases where somebody says, no, I was sitting in the house and I was looking down the hallway and clearly saw a person who I didn't recognize walking toward me. And I'm going to share some stories like that here with you in a bit. And that person's walking toward me, and then I can see through them all of a sudden. And I go from being terrified at the person who's broken into my house and who's walking toward me to now I can see straight through them and they're gone. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, proof of ghosts. We now know ghosts exist. We're still left with the question, okay, well, what was that person's experience? And there are a range of interpretations of that too. But still, I would say that is the kind of phenomena that interests me from a very skeptical perspective. Tell me about if you have seen something that you cannot explain, but which unequivocally in your waking, state of mind, you were looking at this and said, okay, I saw what conforms to our traditional definition of a specter or haunting, not I think I was touched. I felt a little breeze. Right. I heard a little noise. Right?
Well, I think that the credibility of an experience like that exponentially becomes more believable when it's not just one person that experiences something like that.
So that is exactly right. And again, I've just got to make a corollary there. The same thing is how many traditional UFO researchers treat that subject too. If you've got a really good case with just one witness, that isn't as good as a pretty good case when you've got 4 witnesses who can all independently verify what they saw, and they all can provide details about what was observed. And if it was documented in some way, i.e. on film, right, or in some other kind of a sensory capacity, or using technology beyond the human senses, that makes it better as well. And again, that all these things you'll see, there are corollaries. Those apply to the study of ghosts, I would think, too. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, just to take the example that you'd given a second ago and to just give it the +1, the famous rock star of the Police and his solo project, Sting, claimed that he lived in a castle, and one night he woke up and there's a woman standing there in a dress in the corner of his castle bedroom. He comes to, looks at this person who's standing there watching him and his wife sleep. He then starts to nudge his wife and wake her up. She wakes up and sees the same woman, and they both laid there in the bed for a second and watched her before they both witnessed her fade away and disappear. So this is a different instance where you have 2 people that are claiming very clearly that they witnessed something that should not, as far as we understand our reality, exist.
Let's touch on that one for just a second, because in terms of the subcategories of ghostly phenomena, right? And again, let me just acknowledge, I know that there may be some listeners who would say, well, Micah sounds too skeptical. I want to hear a good ghost story. Promise, we're going to get to some of those.
Hey, and also, I know I say this all the time, but Austin and I don't claim to know what ghosts are. In fact, I've never seen a full-bodied apparition. Yeah. I've certainly experienced some stuff in my life that I found to be strange, no doubt. But I don't know if I believe in ghosts because I've never seen what Sting saw.
I believe that there are people who believe they have seen ghosts, and they describe seeing things that conform to our traditional description, our definition of what a ghost is supposed to be. I don't doubt that people have seen those kinds of things, and I've had people tell me those stories.
Same, and I tend to believe them because there's too many people that have said they've seen this shit.
But I stop short of saying that once someone has told me they saw that, therefore I can prove ghosts exist, or that therefore I know what that phenomena represents. because somebody tells me they saw a ghost, that to me does not prove the existence of the afterlife. That does not prove that ghosts are spirits of a deceased individual that can exist independently of their corporeal body.
Yeah.
As some sort of a apparitional essence. Again, a person saying they saw that doesn't prove those things to me. And it's not being skeptical and saying, I doubt them. I don't believe them. What it is me saying is, you are describing what classically sounds like our definition of a ghost.
Right.
But I can't make a leap of logic in saying that, well, because you say you saw an apparitional form standing in the bedroom, Sting, that was an incredible story. Thank you for coming on the show and talking about it with us.
But you're drunk.
But again, that to me, I can't say, and therefore, gosh, I mean, we know that spirits of the dead can haunt the living, right? I don't know what he and his wife experienced. Now, the subcategories, and again, the reason I'm pointing all this out is because there are some, I joke about Wikipedia, but I mean, there are certain editors on that website, there are people in the sciences and in academia who they would think it was an absurd waste of time to even have this conversation. And I really enjoy pushing back on that kind of attitude.
Yeah, and I like telling them they can go themselves.
Anyone who thinks that I am, just too skeptical, relish with me in the fact that I'm going to always push back on the people who think that this idea or that idea is foolish and we're not going to talk about it because in our wise, modern society, we know better than to talk about these things, to the point that I think both of you have really made already in this conversation, but Austin said it most recently. Too many people describe these experiences for me to say, well, then that sounds unlikely, therefore it's not real. Again, at one time we used to say it was very unlikely and therefore probably not true that stones fell from the sky. We at one time didn't understand why people would get sick in hospitals. We didn't know that there were literally what were to us at the time prior to the invention of the microscope, microbial, i.e. invisible killers that were lurking in that environment, and that we all had them all over our bodies, especially on the hands of the surgeons, and they would go deliver the babies, and the mothers would get sick and die.
I also just find it so insane, though, when it's just like there are so many people reporting that they have seen this stuff. I've talked to so many beyond credible people that have experienced what I would call, what is it Ray Stantz says, a class 5 roaming specter.
I thought you were going to say a class 4 metaspectre, but go ahead.
Well, the point that I'm trying to make is I find it so absurd that it's like people keep reporting seeing apparitions, no matter what that is, no matter what like religious connotation you want to, put forth with your own beliefs as to what you might think that might be. Too many people keep reporting this stuff. It is idiotic to me to not have interest in this phenomenon, whether it's completely something that is in the human psyche or not. It is idiotic to me to not want to chase down that dark hallway and understand more about it. Because, I mean, again, at the end of the day, the implications could be very deep as far as, our archetypal understanding and fundamental understanding of like who we are and what we are in the software that's built in here. But the other side of it too is the inference of what it potentially could mean for an afterlife is just equally fascinating to me. And I'm not sold on either one.
Right. Well, I mean, one more thing, I'll just add really quickly about that. To me, again, you can kind of look at this similar to the UFO issue. Obviously, I'm making a lot of comparisons here. When we look at UFOs, there are probably a lot of different things that UFOs are. By that, again, and this was even written in the ODNI's report back in 2021, they had several categories. There are experimental aircraft that are being designed by, a government contractor, not a government agency, but, a contractor like Lockheed Martin or someone. There are probably drones that are being operated, and they're sometimes being operated by foreign actors, right? China, Russia.
Sure.
There are natural phenomena like plasmas and things that people see. And then there's this other category where it's a small category where stuff that we can't rule out as being one of these other things falls into. Here again, ghosts are probably very similar. There are a range of different types of experiences and different underlying phenomena that, for lack of a full understanding of these issues, they get put in the ghost category. And in likelihood, just like UAP, there are those what we might call real UAP, genuine anomalies, very small category. And then there are all these other things that get put in the ghost category. Let me give you an example of one. Years ago, I interviewed a guy named Dr. David J. Hufford. And David Hufford made the focus of his research sleep paralysis. One of the reasons why was because when he was in college, he woke up one afternoon and his friends had said that they were going to go out to dinner, and he said, I'm just exhausted. We've got exams coming up. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to rest. So he laid down, he went to rest, and nobody was in the apartment, and he was there by himself, and he wakes up, And he says all of a sudden he feels like there's someone pushing down on his chest, and really he feels like they're trying to suffocate him. And he can't move. So he's awake and he is fully aware, but he can't move, and he thinks he's being choked or strangled by somebody, suffocated. And he immediately begins to freak out. He's like, somebody is on top of me trying to kill me, and I'm here by myself. I'm going to die. They're going to come back to the apartment and find me here dead. And then all of a sudden he snaps out of it. He's able to move. He's very frightened. He has no idea what happened. And so he's initially kind of going, okay, was this some sort of a weird, psychotic break from reality? Did I just have some sort of a seizure? He completely failed to be able to understand in that moment what was going on. So he starts doing research into this, and it ends up leading him down this path of, as an academic, trying to understand the various different manifestations of sleep paralysis and how it's interpreted in different cultures. And intriguingly, and this is something that folklorists will find interesting, and I always love too, is when you find elements of folklore that have continuity between different cultures around the world that don't have direct contact.
We've talked about that a fair amount on the show before.
Yeah.
Alan Greenfield actually brought up an example of that when we spoke with him.
Of course, I'm sure Greenfield did, absolutely. I mean, and that's just the kind of thing that would fascinate him,
Mm-hmm.
You look at fox weddings. All around the world, there are traditions about when it rains, when the sun's shining, that foxes are getting married. And in some cultures, it may be coyotes or it may be deer or even monkeys, but the majority of cultures around the world where there are foxes, they attribute that to a fox wedding. And so this is an interesting anthropological question. Why do these cultures share these very eerily similar beliefs? Well, David Hufford found that with sleep paralysis, many cultures describe what they call the witch riding your back, or the old hag that is on top of you and pushing you down. Now, to apply this potentially to a really good ghost story or two, because as Hufford began to find out, not only is sleep paralysis a real thing, and he had that happen. By the way, I've had that happen. Either of you had that happen?
Yeah.
Multiple times.
Yeah.
Just a few decades ago, we didn't know what that was, but people would go to the doctor. They would say, I had this thing happen the other day. And the doctor would say, okay, well, you may be showing signs of schizophrenia or something. And they would literally prescribe antipsychotic medications until we knew, oh, that's a normal thing. What's going on is the chemicals your body produces to keep you from thrashing around when you're laying there
Yeah,
asleep.
sometimes you wake up in that shit.
Yeah, and
Man, I have about an annual dream involving the archetypal hag.
Yeah.
At least once a year.
And I've had incredible stories people have told me about ghosts that come and lay on top of them and whisper into their ear or tell them that they love them. And these are incredible ghost stories, but beyond a certain point, there are usually these little factors that you can tell. What did you do? Did you embrace the ghost back? No, the weird thing was I couldn't move while it was doing all this. I'm thinking, okay. And you can usually tell without injecting leading questions when somebody's describing sleep paralysis and they haven't had experience with that before.
Yeah.
The only way I knew it happened to me the first time that I experienced it was because I'd read about it in a magazine.
Same.
I was like,
Yep.
oh, this is happening to me.
Exactly.
I had talked to people that had experienced it. And I think if you didn't have any prior knowledge to what it felt like, it's already a disturbing situation. It scared the shit out of me.
Oh, it's scary as hell. Now, here's a borderland case, though, for that, which is really strange. I was at a hotel many years ago with two friends of mine. The power went out in the hotel. We weren't guests there. We were just visiting. And this little woman comes out of one of the rooms while we're standing out there in the dark, and she says, oh, you guys like chocolate-covered strawberries? And I said, are you a clown? And are you holding a balloon? And have you crawled out of a sewer? Because as long as that's not the case, I'll accept one of your strawberries.
She's like, no, but oddly enough, my name is It.
Yeah, exactly. So, but she comes over and she says, you guys look like ghost hunters. And I said, yeah, we're interested in the lore and everything. And so she says, well, I got to tell you a story that was told to us at breakfast this morning. She was part of a group that was on a trip up from Texas. And this man had shown up at breakfast, and they said he looked disheveled. He hadn't shaved. And they said, what's going on, Tom? You don't look too good. And he says, well, he said, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I felt this pressure on my chest. And when I opened my eyes, he said, I looked up, and there was this old woman sitting on me, on top of me, and I thought somebody had broken into my hotel room. And I'm like, what's going on here? And he said there were the first thing I saw when I opened my eyes were the pink ruffles of her dress. And I look up and she's very gaunt, had long, straight silver hair, and she's looking down at me. So I'm immediately going to tell her, ma'am, what are you doing in my room? And then he says, I feel the weight lift, and she vanishes, and then she's gone. And I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Now, I would classify that story as probably being a sleep paralysis story. Now, here's the hook. Here's the borderland part of this one. That story took place in room 545 at the Grove Park Inn. Now,
there you go.
This is true. This story was personally conveyed to me by a woman from Texas who had never been to Grove Park Inn and didn't know about the lore, let alone associated with that room.
Yeah.
Where Tom had been staying and claimed he had an encounter where now think about popular descriptions of the famous Pink Lady. Go back, ladies and gentlemen, listen to episode 1 of Ghosts in the Mountains for a full debrief on that. See, I just did a double whammy right
You did.
there.
Bam!
But again, the Pink Lady is often described as looking young and beautiful. Here we had the old hag. I mean, the quintessential old hag experience, but with a pink dress in room 545 into a man who knew nothing about the lore.
As far as we know. Now, and look, I'm not trying to crap on Tom's story, but I will throw some things out
shit
there.
all over it. I don't care.
I'm not going to take a shit on it, but I will say this. There is information about the Pink Lady at the Grove Park Inn.
Yeah, there's a display.
At the time that he was there.
This was probably about 12 or 13. Actually, man, this might have been closer to 20 years ago.
Well, but here's the question. I don't know how much information was about the Pink Lady at the Grove Park Inn at the time. I do remember there being some sort of information, but I don't think that they had the display and the dress over there in the corner at the time.
Probably not.
This might be a bit of a speculative angle, but what do you think of the possibility this is something that just subconsciously maybe he heard a conversation about it and the thought entered the back of his head?
There are several possibilities here. Let's just look at a few here. One, Tom, for all we know, he arrived in Asheville and the whole crew got up there on Thursday night. Maybe Tom went out for a night on the town and he came across a copy of a well-known book in this area called Haunted Asheville. And maybe he grabbed a copy of the book and he said, I'm just going to play a little prank on some of my folks. Oh, wow, I'm staying in 545. This is too good. I've got to mess with them. Could have been a hoax. Now, the idea about hoaxes, often there is this notion that hoaxes are malicious intent, people who are trying to either make money or just trying to, mess with people, mess with believers. There are a range of different things that cause people to engage in hoaxes. And I'm going to tell you, probably one of the number one reasons is skeptics who are just trying to pull people's legs, skeptics who are just kind of trying to have fun, and not even ideological skeptics who are trying to make a point about science and wisdom and reason. No, a lot of the time it's just people who are just trying to have fun and they don't believe the ghost story and they're like, we're going to watch this,
Wasn't Gray Barker kind of notorious for
Very
stuff
much
like that?
He was, and actually, to tell you the truth, his contemporary, John Keel, was a little like that too.
Yeah.
A lot of people are like that. My point being, the idea that the hoax is always driven by malicious intent, that's not really the case.
Well, I don't even know necessarily that what we're talking about in this instance is a hoax, because I think it could be
I'm saying that's a possibility, though.
Right.
We're looking at interpretations of what Tom's experience could be, right?
I'm saying also, I think maybe even the more likely scenario is that he actually did experience sleep paralysis. However, there were prior knowledge that maybe he took in or overheard or something that was supplied to him about the Grove Park Inn that then influenced his dream state.
That would seem most likely to me. I would probably have to say that Tom's experience sounds too damn much like the archetypal old hag sleep paralysis experience to rule that out as a factor.
And the pressure on the chest thing.
Yeah.
It sounds
It's
just
textbook.
like it's textbook. It is textbook. But there are clearly those Pink Lady-ish, or his interpretation of that, and how he would have expected it to look.
Never heard her, again, like you said, I've never heard her described as an old woman.
Right.
It's
The silver
always
hair.
been a young person.
It sounds like, again, a subconscious, as though Tom were subconsciously exposed to enough of the mythos that it kind of invades his mind, but he has his own unique interpretation that's totally uncharacteristic of the Pink Lady archetype as known there at Grove Park, because he wasn't familiar enough with it.
Right.
It very well could have been something he was exposed to subconsciously. That would be my interpretation. So I think what Caleb actually has proposed is probably the solution. But looking at other possibilities, if we wanted to get really speculative, there's this idea of, but what if the sleep paralysis experience is somehow, and I'm not saying this actually happens, I'm just trying to put all possibilities on the table, all right? But let's say that in the sleep paralysis experience, you are in this sort of a borderland state, and that your psyche is somehow susceptible to influence from, external factors, and that, if there were some psychic imprint about that room or the area or the building that legitimately did have something to do with hauntings, was he in a kind of a altered state of consciousness? I think we could safely call a sleep paralysis experience an altered state of consciousness.
Sure.
In fact, I know many people, they're skeptics, who have described having the experience and been fully awake and aware and seen apparitions in the room, but they knew what was happening. I've had that happen too. But is it possible that a person could literally actually pick up on psychic impressions from the environment? Again, I don't know. I think that's less likely than what Caleb proposed. My skeptical mind wants to say this was sleep paralysis and there was some sort of, maybe even a subliminal, subconscious influence that was influencing his experience, and there's the pink lady aspects that appear.
Yeah.
But again, looking at all these different possibilities, that's what I'd call one of these interesting borderland cases.
Well, one thing that I always kind of go back to Carl Jung to kind of look at things that are potentially dealing in, the archetypal and the like. And one thing I don't think he really lands on this in the Red Book, but he does maybe kind of allude to the idea that maybe human beings are able to somehow collectively tap into a greater consciousness,
yes,
right?
The collective unconscious is
Collective,
literally what he calls it.
And maybe that's the realm that people claim to be able to astral project from and things like that. But the point that I'm trying to get towards is in the event that the things that Jung had theorized about were true, maybe this guy that experienced this pink lady thing didn't have to hear anything about the pink lady. There was enough information about that. He's in this heightened state, this, I don't know what you want to call it, a sleep state, a fugue state, something like that. And he's just tapping into some other stuff. And then that is literally beaming back. Now, most people would look at that and be like, that is some pseudoscientific, speculative bullshit. And that's fine. I don't give a shit.
No, I would actually differ with them on that point. See, this is the thing. A lot of modern, I was actually sitting in a bar in downtown Asheville having a beer one time. And this bar was really cool. It was actually located inside an antique shop. And so I was sitting there and I was waiting on my friend, Mr. McNonymous, Chris McCullum, and this Australian gent came and sat in. He was about my age and he sat down next to me and we ended up, just chatting over a beer randomly. So me and this Australian are sitting here talking and we got around to the discussion of Jung. And he says, oh yeah, fascinating stuff. Wasn't it all proven wrong? And again, I think that the attitude today among many is that, oh yeah, Jung and Freud, they were completely off base. Actually, people would probably say, Freud seemed to be the one who was kind of closer to the truth. Others would say Jung. I always preferred Jung, but there are people who are just like this. Some of Jung's ideas were just nuttier than squirrel turds. They were definitely out there at times, but again, I don't think that he was really off base. I mean, he created a lot of interesting things.
Dude, you want to talk about the collective unconscious? This is so weird. I was standing on the porch today. I'm not kidding. I was standing on the porch today and I was like, I'd like to work in, at some point tonight, I'd love to work in the phrase nuttier than squirrel shit on the podcast tonight, because I was like, that's just such a good phrase. And then here your ass comes along and says it.
Well, see,
while we're talking about the collective consciousness.
Actually, what Jung would have called that was a synchronicity.
Yeah.
Sure, well, exactly. See, it was, but...
This was Jung's big thing. Jung would look at these seemingly paranormal phenomena, and as a physician, as he would say, he was like, okay, let's see if we can actually break this down and figure out if there's a psychological reason these things happen. What is the meaningful coincidence? Why do synchronicities happen? The famous story was he was talking with Sigmund Freud about this and everything, and he was talking about this, I can't remember exactly what he was describing, but as he's saying this, there's this loud pop that happens in this drawer next to him and everything, and Freud's like, what was that? And for Jung, it was like, that was the intensity of my argument I'm trying to make, and he says, and I shall do it again, and there it goes again, boom. And Freud was pretty freaked out by that. Now, those two ended up, of course, going on very different paths. But again, I think that those who would say, well, Jung, it was all disproven, that guy was just crazy. He certainly wasn't the kind of neuroscientist or psychologist of today. There certainly were very meaningful discoveries that he made.
For sure. And I think a lot of psychiatrists are still very influenced by Jung's work. I think Jungian psychiatry is a big kind of subsect of that field.
Again, my point would be that anyone who says, oh, wasn't it all disproven or wasn't it wrong? Well, go ask a Jungian psychologist, see what they would say about that. And really, I think that most academic psychologists, psychoanalysts, et cetera, will say that Jung was highly influential and that his work still influences the field. But again, the thing that fascinated me about him was how in his early papers, what's he looking at? He's looking at, spiritualism and the idea of mediumship and channeling and people who claim to channel the spirits of the dead. Jung described in some of his papers on phenomenology people who would be visited in the night by grotesque kobolds, keeping in mind this is a English translation from the German, and in various different instances, goblin or kobold, these terms are used interchangeably, but to me, the person waking up in the middle of the night and being visited by strange little grotesque beings standing around their bed. What does that sound like? I mean, it's like
Dogman.
It sounds almost like an alien abduction experience.
Yeah.
Sure.
Now,
isn't there a lot of crossover with sleep paralysis and those experiences?
Yes, there is.
Well?
Now, the question would be, did Jung know? Probably didn't. Did his patients know at the time anything about sleep paralysis? No. As a matter of fact, even as recently as when the big UFO alien abduction claims began to surface back in the 1980s and 90s, I mean, did people really have a broad awareness of sleep paralysis back then? Not really, not as much as they do today. Now, I'm not trying to say that everybody who wakes up in the middle of the night like Sting and his wife did, and they say that they see a ghost, that they were just having sleep paralysis. But what I am saying is that clearly some of these cases fall into that camp. Clearly some of those alien abduction cases fall into that camp. Clearly, it sounds like in the literature of Carl Jung, he was describing that phenomenon decades before it was understood. Other things that he identified before they were understood was the idea of the midlife crisis. He seemed to describe that. He was looking, again, like I mentioned, at a lot of the things that were sort of the anchor points of spiritualism, channeling and mediumship. He was interested in all that stuff. But then, of course, he also was very interested in these ideas of synchronicity and the idea that our minds may not necessarily be completely and solely separated from one to the next, that we maybe are all united by a kind of collective unconscious. And when it comes to, and this is coming back around to ghosts, this is where things get kind of interesting, because Jung's concept that probably is best known is the archetype. The idea of, and again, I'll see evolutionary biologists and people these days who don't like Jung, they'll say archetype is a nice way of trying to say stereotype. Yet again, I respectfully disagree. If you look at ghost stories, right, you guys on your episode about the Pink Lady revealed that not only is there the Pink Lady of the Grove Park Inn, but there happens to be a film about a Pink Lady.
Yeah.
I'd find it very interesting to go online and look at all the different hotels around the world that allegedly have a Pink Lady that haunts the hotel.
It's not just the Pink Lady. I was late night, couple nights back, put on some OG Art Bell because I love it. And I put on some of his Ghost to Ghost episodes. First story that comes on, he's talking about a hotel that is haunted by the Red Lady.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is so damn close to the telling of the Pink Lady. It's absurd.
Here's another one. What about the girl who haunts the highway? You're driving along at night and there's a girl. She's standing there in her prom dress and you slow down and say, "Are you okay?" And she says, "Can you just give me a ride to my parents' house?" So the girl gets in the car and you're giving her a ride and you're talking to her and everything. And she's talking from the back seat and she's saying, "Okay, you can let me out here." And you get to the house and you look back and said, "Well, can I?" And she's gone. Oh, she must have already gotten out of the car. But you go to the front door and you knock at the door like you do in the middle of the night, right, to a random stranger's house. And you knock at the door to make sure that she got in okay. And an old, sad-looking couple come to the door and they say, "Oh, you must have given our daughter a ride home. She died 45 years ago on this night."
This happens to me every Thursday.
Now, the funny thing is one of those stories about a woman who was tragically killed and who haunts a road. That story is associated with 191 Highway right down here in Asheville.
Yep.
That story is all over the place.
Everywhere.
Brevard has its own version of that, for that matter.
Towns all over the place have that story.
Yeah.
Okay, what about Helen's Bridge?
Oh, well,
Yeah.
There are Helen's Bridges all over the place.
There's tons of places like
Helen's
that.
House. Again,
Helen's Mountain.
my point is, of course, you start seeing what Jung would call the archetype, what the folklorists might say, these are certain folkloric categoric types. You see that in ghosts as well, and I think that probably the reason why is because, yet again, we have to differentiate between a legitimate ghost, an actual observation of a phantasm of the living, right, an apparitional form, and the folklore associated with people's alleged encounters that is built up over time and becomes very quickly superstitious folklore, legends, folk tales about a region. A lot of the ghost stories that make their way into books are the latter category. They are the folk tales that probably, they may have a grain of truth, but those are probably not people actually going and seeing ghosts all the time. And but they certainly give rise to belief in haunted houses, haunted bridges, haunted roadways, haunted hotels, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's been countless episodes of the podcast so far where we've found ourselves looking into stuff like that and found that it essentially is just an archetypal mixture, a melting pot of different folklores. But when talking about, the documentation of, actually scientifically minded people that have really looked into this and put down on paper everything that they could possibly find and kind of trying to differentiate these things from being complete psychological manifestations and or apparitions that are post-corporeal human entities. One of the things that you and I, Micah, were talking about on the phone the other day that I found to be pretty fascinating was this, 2-volume tome that you mentioned called The Phantasms of the Living. Because I'd never really heard of this stuff, and I was kind of fascinated by it.
The Society for Psychical Research was from London. They were founded in 1882. They had their headquarters in London. They had archives held at Cambridge University Library. There is a overview of the 2-volume set you were talking about, which is called Phantasms of the Living. And I'm going to read from that overview, which is provided in a version you can buy online on Amazon. But in fact, if you want to share a link with some of your listeners, you can actually read these books, the digitized copies of these, which I may have sent you one, but they've been made available online, and you can find them on archive.org. And the summary here reads, these books contain the first, or rather this book, so this is the version on Amazon, which is a condensed volume with both of them.
Yeah.
This book contains the first 2 volumes of Phantasms of the Living, an 1886 work on the subject of spiritualism by leading members of the Society for Psychical Research, Edmund Gurney, Frederick W.H. Myers, and Frank Podmore. The authors documented more than 700 cases of ghost sightings, which they believe are in fact evidence of psychic ability. One of their contentions is essentially that they're actually looking at a range of different things. They're looking at psychic impressions, different kinds of experiences that really in modern parlance we would associate more with like psychic phenomena.
Yeah.
Maybe a few instances of bilocation where an individual is supposed to be one place, but someone has a actual waking, observation of them in a place where they weren't supposed to be. And sometimes that also coincides with that person being, in danger or worried about that individual. So these were all things that were seemingly that linked the minds of humans, but they put apparitions in those forms too.
Is that a crisis apparition? Is that the term?
That might be that might be a term that you could apply for that. Yeah, a crisis apparition. There are, again, you can read about this online, and there are books that have been written about it. But the idea that especially family members, if somebody's in danger, a family member will appear to somebody. And they are either communicating that they are in danger, or the person who is in danger sees an apparition of that loved one trying to help them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating stuff, and it does seem to almost tap into the whole, collective unconscious idea. That there are certain things that connect us on a deeper level than just, language and nowadays, text messages. So, but the Society for Psychical Research, they did say psychical. Yeah, back in those days, not psychic. Yes, the Society for Psychical Research. That's essentially the kind of thing that they were looking at. And in Phantasms of the Living, they're covering all that phenomena, not just ghosts, but there are ghost, accounts in there as well. Yes, this is fairly dated material. Yes, this is material that was being assembled in the late 19th century. But their whole approach was, to your point, they were trying to go about it very systematically, and they were trying to approach it scientifically at that time. And at that time, I think it was also fairly, again, given the popular, religion that came around, spiritualism, that was really thriving between that period and the very early 1920s, and then Spiritism in parts of Europe, the, version that came about there, with all the interest in that. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and many others were very interested in spiritualism, the idea of channeling and mediumship and all these things. And so it seemed like at that time, given its popular interest, and also, I guess, the general acceptance of, the notion that at that time and in the world of the late 19th century, studying ghosts isn't going to be something that, is necessarily completely off the table, but we're going to go about it scientifically. That's essentially what they were trying to do, these 3 gentlemen you were describing, Caleb, and Phantasms of the Living does that. Now, again, to go through the book, I mean, there's so much stuff. I would actually recommend people, in the interest of time here, just go online and check it out. Yeah. It's pretty dense reading. It was written in the 19th century. Again, it's not going to really...
They don't speak our native tongue.
They really don't. I mean, it's not really going to be extremely exciting reading for the modern reader. I'll just say that.
Yeah.
But it is a good example of, I think, how attitudes toward this topic have changed, how at one time there were people who were trying to systematically, collect information, categorize, and then, discern, what do these phenomena seem to represent? And essentially their takeaway was humans experience weird psychic phenomena, and we, in that category of phenomena, we also place apparitions. And the fact that people can observe and sometimes communicate with apparitions are one, finger on the glove, so to speak, of the broader human psychic experience. That was what they said. Yeah. And again, what they were saying is the same thing that you guys have said about ghosts, though. Throughout time, people have had this experience. We can't explain what that is, but there's too much data to rule it out as simply being nonsense.
Yeah, because kind of what I distilled from what they were talking about, and again, I didn't go through and read the whole thing, but I kind of got the vibe that they were pretty much landing where Jung was landing with it, as to where they kind of thought that a vast majority of what was going on actually was taking place in the human psyche.
Yeah, totally.
And I don't know, it's just weird because there are certain stories that you hear from certain people who they experience a very haunted house, and multiple members of the family experience, number one, the standard stuff, footsteps, bumps in the night, that sort of stuff. Then multiple family members report seeing the same apparition going about the house. If Jung were looking at this, potentially if these guys from the Phantasms of the Living volumes were looking at it, maybe they would kind of classify that as being some form of a tulpa, a mental manifestation. But it does get a little bit weird when a particular house or residence or whatever is haunted, and people keep seeing an entity that they'd never seen before. They don't know who this person is, but this entity keeps showing up in their house. Multiple people see this entity. Some people are being physically touched by this entity, and then they go into the old records and they find information about this person, and they see a clip of him in the newspaper, and that's the guy.
Well,
that's the person.
So on that note, another kind of, and I'm going to tie this back in with spiritualism, but when you talk about the idea of there being records that would validate a story involving a ghost, I'll tell you a story about a guy who never saw a ghost, but he claims he had a conversation with one. And in fact, he wrote a song about that called Conversations with a Ghost, because the man who told me the story is the famous Bostonian songwriter Ellis Paul. And Ellis, he is an incredible musician, incredible songwriter. His songs have been featured in films over the years, and he travels around the country and performs. And so one year, when he came and he performed at the Gray Eagle here in Asheville, I was working in radio at the time, and so I was the producer that afternoon, in fact, and we had Ellis come sit in the studio and perform a few songs, and I got to sit right next to him and hang out and talk to Ellis Paul. And he sang this song for us, Conversation with a Ghost, and the reason he wanted to do this was because the person actually conducting the interview, I was in there helping him, but it was Joshua Warren actually doing the interview.
Never heard of him.
And so Josh says, Micah, this guy's a musician and a songwriter, so you should come in and do this interview with me, being a musician. So I came in, sat down next to Ellis, and we're hanging out and talking. Josh naturally says, have you ever had a paranormal experience? And Ellis says, well, yeah, I have, and I wrote a song about it. What had happened was he was at this event, a gathering with some friends, and he goes up and he talks to one of them. I think her name was Margaret. What have you been doing lately? And she says, well, we've been playing around with this Ouija board. And he says, oh, well, I'm a doubter. But she says, well, we've been getting some interesting things happening. He says, well, I don't really believe all that stuff, but you want to demonstrate it and show? She says, sure. So she and a friend began messing around with this. And I think what they end up doing is they say, since you're the doubter, Ellis, you should actually try doing this yourself. So they're working with him. And sure enough, this spirit who identifies herself as a woman comes through and starts detailing a very elaborate story about how she'd been married to a doctor and all this stuff. And Ellis started asking her questions. And the questions that he asked were not questions so much. Initially, maybe they were asking about the woman and trying to get to know her, but he starts asking her other questions. Like, what was the last song I played in my set last night? And she spells out rain. And he had played a song, I think, that, it had rain in the title. He asks it. I remember what it was. His fingers were not on the board because that was the clincher. He wasn't, again, the question would be if his fingers had been on the planchette, he might have been influencing it. No, what he was doing was he was asking the questions, and these two girls had their fingers on the planchette and were moving it. Anyway, I've got a recording of all this too, where he tells this story. I archived it. So anyway, he's asking the questions. They're moving the planchette, and he asks the question about what was the last song I did last night. What is my manager's name? It spells his name. It misspells his name, but gets the name right. And these girls didn't know this stuff. And he said, I was so freaked out, I had to go sit in the bathroom for a minute and just like splash some water on my face. So he wrote a song about that. But it was such an interesting experience because you hear about the idea. Now, again, the scientific theory here is automatism, right? Or, the idea that, very, very minute, literally subliminal muscular movement is what's actually happening, and that a group of people all with their fingers on the planchette, that's what's controlling the movement. It's not something paranormal. I don't doubt that there are these, very minute muscular movements that are influencing the control of whether it's the planchette on the Ouija board or whether it's a pendulum you're holding. Sure, that's known to occur, and I think we can explain the mechanism behind it. But how do you explain a popular singer-songwriter asking the questions while the women are the ones moving the planchette, and whatever claims to be coming through gets the questions right? Now, so the final bit of the story was, he said his friend and he were so compelled by this story because the woman had told all these details about her life and who she'd been married to. So they go down to the county records office and they're going through the records and they find the woman, the doctor she was married to, and it all added up. It all was, and in fact, that part I believe he told off the air. We'd gone to a commercial break, but he leans over and he tells me, what the weirdest part was, Micah? That, we were able to confirm all the details, the historical details that the woman provided, as she claimed she was, through the Ouija board that the two women, his friends at the party, were controlling the planchette for. So, yet again, I put that in the Borderland case because, sure, we know about, automatism or, about, all these phenomena that are supposed to be the driving force behind why people delude themselves into thinking that Ouija boards can actually communicate with the dead. But what happens when a person standing a few feet away from a couple of girls controlling it is asking the questions? They don't know the answers, and something again, supposedly on the other side, some intelligence is giving the right answers.
Well,
that's so wild.
I'm not trying to be completely skeptical about the Ouija board thing because, again, I speculate a lot about this stuff. I don't have like a serious belief system that I attribute to any of this, but I like to keep the door open to whatever. I've heard a lot of very interesting, compelling stories about use of a Ouija board, which I have always, growing up, our mother put the fear of God in us that we shouldn't touch one, right? So one night, Josh Warren's like, "No, we're playing with one, bitch. Go down to the basement. Let's go down there and let's talk to the dead." And I was like, "I'm not doing this." He's like, "No, you are." We go down there. I'm not into the idea at all. We put our hands on the Ouija board, and after experiencing that, I'm like, how the hell does the bit ever move? Because I don't know. It's like you're not going to move. Like in my experience with Josh,
you got to put some force on there.
You got to move the damn thing, and that's obviously being moved by you. Now, if you want to entertain the ideas of like mediumship and all that stuff, that's a whole other thing. I'm not always sold on that aspect of it.
When finances are involved, especially so.
Right.
But I will say, I have definitely experienced some strange psychic phenomenon. I've known people that have had some time and time again proved psychic ability, or at least that's how it seems. But, one other thing that has really been strange to me, and I've heard a ton of stories of this too, and it's been perplexing for a long time, and this, I guess, kind of goes into the realm of ghost stuff, but I think it's more so the idea of afterlife and or reincarnation, because we're basically dealing with exactly that. These stories of these kids that get born, they have irrational fears of things. There's been kids that have been born and said that they were in 9/11. There's been a lot of kids that have claimed that they were other people.
Yeah, we I think off the record, we probably talked about the Dalai Lama a few weeks ago.
Right.
But the perfect example of that.
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is that's weird with that is now you can talk about epigenetic memories and things of the like, and if you're unfamiliar with the term, that's essentially a memory that is passed down from, a father or a grandfather, somebody in your line of DNA, your genetic bloodline. This does not necessarily seem to be in that same category because a lot of these kids claim to be people that they were 100% not related to. There were children that claimed that they had been a part of Iwo Jima. These kids did not know what the hell Iwo Jima was. Probably didn't hear about the Iwo Jima Memorial in their preschool class. Just throwing that out there.
Or at least retain it.
But children that knew specific details about specific people that they had no prior knowledge and probably would not have known, there's been a lot of stories about this where the parents are just like, we don't know where the hell they would have gotten this stuff. We're almost 99% sure that there is no foreign information, some place where he or she is getting this information. And yet they know dates. They know lieutenants. They know who their drill sergeants were.
Are you guys familiar with Dr. Jim B. Tucker?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, so he's a University of Virginia scientist who wrote a book called Life Before Life. And his work actually was inherited. I believe it was Dr. Ian Stevenson had been the professor that was doing this before him, but Tucker inherited his body of work. I interviewed Dr. Jim Tucker. In fact, I think when this book came out, Life Before Life, I think that it had actually been his publicist had reached out to me and said, would you like to have Dr. Tucker on and interview him? I'm like, yeah. I'd heard about his work for years. Let me give you a quick synopsis, though, based on his website of what this book talks about. Because, again, there are a lot of people who would say, well, the idea of reincarnation, yet again, this is pseudoscientific nonsense. Well, here's Dr. Tucker's approach. As the description here reads, this popular overview of research into children's reports of past life memories describes a collection of 2,500 cases. 2,500.
That's a lot. Dude.
At the University of Virginia that investigators have carefully studied since Dr. Ian Stevenson began the work more than 50 years ago. The children usually begin talking about a past life at the age of 2 or 3 and may talk about a previous family or the way that they died in a previous life. Again, this is an academic who has studied this and inherited a body of work that goes back 50 years, 2,500 cases, and these are commonalities he's describing. Their statements have often been found to be accurate for one particular deceased individual, and some children have recognized members of a previous family. A number have also had birthmarks or defects that matched wounds on the body of the deceased person. So, again, it was fascinating talking with this, career scientist, academician, who has been like, my mentor, Dr. Stevenson, was ridiculed in his day for studying this stuff. But, of course, being exposed to that body of work, I've carried on the torch, and we've talked to a lot of families and a lot of children, and we have studied meticulously the kids who say these kinds of things. 2,500 cases, and again, that's just the body of work that they're looking at.
Yeah, that he has. Well, here's one observation that I have taken away from all of the cases, almost all the cases that I have looked at. Every single time it seems as though, again, around that age of 2 or 3, the kids start talking about this stuff, and then maybe about the time, usually earlier than this, but usually about the time that they're maybe 7, 8 years old, gone.
Yeah, it goes away.
It just goes away. Now, I'm just going to I'm going to peddle some pseudoscience as I tend to do on this podcast, but you know what I find that might be relatively indicative of is that when we pass away, now I've had this conversation with our dad a couple of times, and we always speculate about the woo-woo and the weird and whatever that shit is, but we always talk about when we get on this subject, what do you think the afterlife might be like? And sometimes Dad says, well, what do you remember before you were born? And we all go, well, not really anything. We don't have a memory before that. And he goes, well, it might be a lot like that. But if you look at this concept in the perspective of what we were just talking about these kids that, they're naming names. The names are historically accurate.
Yeah, pretty specific stuff.
Very specific stuff. It's indicative to me that you probably know where I'm going with this, that we get our slate wiped clean.
Some of us do.
Well, some of us do, but do you not find that to be a pretty specific understanding and experience here in the world that one's, consciousness and then sometimes these physical manifestations? That to me, again, I don't know what I believe, but I would dare say that the evidence there almost indicates that number one, reincarnation is a very strong possibility. And number two, the reason that we don't understand or remember where we were before we got here is because we get wiped clean. When you talk about also other cases of people that have had near-death experiences and they talk about, oh yeah, I went to the waiting room.
Yeah.
And the doctors were in there, and there were these weird little guys with these funny little faces, and the doctors were like laughing at me because I was like, wait, where am I going? When am I going back to Earth? They were just like poking fun, like they just dealt with this all the time. The next thing I know, I'm sucked back through the wormhole and I land back in my body, and I'm like, what the hell was that? Because I know I was there.
Tangent that we don't really have enough time to get into right now, but maybe for a future discussion that would be interesting is some of the commonalities between the near-death experience and the alien abduction experience.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
There's
Absolutely.
actually quite, and in fact, Whitley Strieber and his late wife, Ann Strieber, used to get so many messages about this, and it led them to think that, the abduction phenomenon has something to do with our dead. And I know Whitley pretty well.
Yeah, you spoke with him a few years ago, right?
Yeah,
On
and
the podcast?
I consider Whitley a friend. He's a fascinating person, and I think that Whitley's at a place in his life now where he's not really sure that the experiences that he details in his book were necessarily all physical. I mean, there's a lot of it that seems to be. And again, I know there are a lot of people who are like, I believe. I mean, aliens are real, and they come down and they pick people up and they put things up people's butts and, all this sort of stuff.
They love that.
Then there are people who are like, this is all really silly. And you're gonna learn from having conversations with me. You guys know this, but dear listeners of this podcast and mine, I'm not a person who deals in absolutes. And even with something that I do not believe in, I try to always walk into the room with this kind of an attitude. Cool, I'm going to leave my bias at the door, and I've entered the realm of possibility. And for the duration we're sitting in this room, I'm going to operate on the partition of my hard drive where I say, what if? Okay? And at the end of the day, I may come back out of the room and be like, okay, that was interesting, nice acid trip, and I'm back to reality. But I mean, I entertain all possibilities as opposed to being like, I'm going to be a hardline absolutist. This is what I believe in. All this nonsense, poppycock.
Micah, only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Well, that's how I feel.
Yeah.
Not like a Sith, but I feel like that's a good analogy. Yeah, the Siths deal in absolutes. I'm a person who says, how do you know if there's a force or not unless you try to use it?
We're the gray Jedi.
Well, you got to sometimes enter the gray zone. And
Yeah.
I don't know if people are really being abducted by aliens, but I know I value my conversations with Whitley.
Some people in Berkshire, Massachusetts might say something different about that.
Literally talked about that today, filming down in Atlanta with a film crew. So, I mean, the thing is that I know people who have had unusual experiences, and I think it's really shitty to go in there and say, you're full of shit and you didn't really have that happen and you don't know what really happened to you. No, when I'm there talking to those people, I listen. Now, to really turn this completely upside down and frustrate everybody now, some would say, okay, so you've interviewed Dr. Jim Tucker and you know about the 2,500 some cases of kids who describe something that happened to another person before that person died, and these kids remember it. So obviously consciousness has to have come from one individual. That person has to have left the corporeal realm, but somehow their consciousness persists for a time at least. Maybe it's gone quantum leap style by the time they reach age 5 or 6 or 7. Quantum Leap, for anybody who never watched that back in the day, again, the whole thing was that...
I know who Scott Bakula is.
Yeah, and so Scott's character, when Sam would leap into a body, it was a sci-fi show, and he would leap throughout time into people's bodies, and he had to, go save people in different eras. Kids under the age of 5 could see Sam for who he really was and not the person whose body he'd leapt into, because, the idea was that kids who were younger, pure of heart and all this. Interesting kind of sci-fi corollary there, because...
Oh, I used to watch that show a lot. It's kind of cool. It did kind of touch on a lot of those weird little things, and it also touched on futurism as well.
It sure did, and really the whole idea of a person from the future, leaping into... It was going in reverse order, which we're going to talk about the thermodynamic arrow of time here real quick before we wrap up. We got to, but...
Yeah.
In that sense, it was kind of reincarnation, but in reverse. Scott from the future, Sam rather, he could leap back into the past into somebody's body, and he could manifest their, within their body his consciousness. But he looked to everybody except for 5-year-olds and younger like that person. Now, the interesting thing is, sure, there are some really interesting cases involving alleged reincarnation. Even Carl Sagan, in his book *The Demon Haunted World*, said, there are some things in our world. And he said, the Loch Ness Monster probably ain't one of them. But there are some things, maybe some UFO sightings. I mean, he debunked a lot of UFOs, and general ideas about UFOs in that book. But he said there are some ideas, and maybe, however dubious some of them sound, there are some phenomena that science hasn't explained yet, and they should be studied. And one of the examples he gave was at least a few of these stories of kids who claim they recall past lives. Even Sagan acknowledged that possibility without committing to belief in it. But as a good scientist, he said, we also need to look at the evidence. Now, I would also say, I happen to know about Jacques Vallée going, to Sagan and saying, my best case is Dr. Jacques Vallée, of course, who studied under J. Allen Hynek, but worked alongside him for years. Ufologist, he's in his 80s now, and he's still doing all this stuff. He gave his best data to Sagan, and Sagan was like, I just don't have time. Jacques, I appreciate it, Jacques, but I haven't got time. And he wouldn't look at it. I'm sure a lot of scientists have done the same thing to Jim Tucker. They're like, great, reincarnation we know isn't real. And Dr. Tucker's like, well, would you like to look at my 2,500 case files? And they're like, haven't got time, wacko. So, yes, there's a phenomenon there. Many would therefore say, well, if kids can remember past lives, then we know that the soul exists. There is life after death. And when people see ghosts, then we're seeing apparitions of the dead. In other words, their soul. And that's what ghosts are. And that's where I draw the line. I've got to say, yes, all those things seem to be related, and they very well may be. But we can't be sure, and we can't necessarily say that because children describe these things, therefore ghosts exist. Therefore, we know that the idea of the soul is real, and therefore, this substantiates all the religions that believe that idea. And it turns out we were all right.
Yeah, well, since early history, that's been presented in earliest religions you could think of.
Yeah.
Pre-biblical. You go back to even like the Iliad has examples of ghosts that were beings in an afterlife state.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, the Greeks were some of the very first ones really to popularize these modern ideas of ghosts. And then they began to actually make them the kind of terrifying ghost of the modern idea of what a ghost is. I believe it was in ancient Greece and in Rome that people would avoid graveyards because they thought that ghosts were really bad news and you didn't want to mess with them. The Greeks also were the ones who were experimenting at the modern hill of St. John the Baptist, where it's believed that back in the 1950s, Sotiris Dokiris, I think, was the archaeologist who excavated this elaborate underground area that they think may have been, one of, or maybe the labyrinth that was described in some of the ancient literature. And intriguingly, in the center of the area, there was this large area where there could have been kind of a pool or some sort of a urn or something that would have held water. And it was the theory of Dr. Raymond Moody, MD, another man who, someone who from a psychological perspective, as a clinical scientist, studied these ideas. Dr. Moody, after reading these ancient Greek and ancient Egyptian ideas about ghosts and people going through a labyrinth and going and communing with the dead, he said, what if we actually tried to recreate what the Greeks called the necromantian? He said, what if we could create something? And so he gave it a different name. He calls it the psychomantium, but this came from the ancient Greek idea of the necromantian. And so Moody, in a barn behind his house, took a mirror, placed it on a wall, put a nice chair in the room, and had people sit across from the mirror. And he would do a session with them where he would be doing grief counseling with somebody, who had lost a loved one. Before he would take them into the room, and he would say, I'm just going to bring you in here. I want you to sit down, look into the mirror, relax, and just sit here and just, kind of meditate, relax for a little while. And many people after the grief counseling session would claim to see the deceased loved one in the mirror. Some people would claim to hear them being able to communicate audibly. A very small number of people would claim that the loved one would come out of the mirror into the room and interact with them. Now, I met Dr. Moody years ago, and I asked him, I said, Dr. Moody, do you think people are seeing real ghosts when this happens? He said, absolutely not. I believe it's all psychological. But he thought that what was going on there was that he figured out what the ancient Greeks were doing when they said people would go see ghosts. He says, I've figured out how to induce this altered state of consciousness that allows people to meet their dead loved ones. So, yet again, add that as another, another perspective on all this. And again, I would caution people from looking at all these different things, past lives, claims of apparitions, psychic phenomena, and say all of it, proves this or that or whatever your bias is or your belief system, whatever your religious beliefs are. It's fine to have religious beliefs, but I constantly see people saying, if this happens and these people claim this happens, that must be related to this. And all these things are, complementary, and they're all part of a grand unified theory of the paranormal. Bigfoot rides on the UFOs, and the UFOs drop them off here on Earth from time to time, right? you got to be careful and learn to draw lines, keep all the little phenomena separated, look at each one. You can appreciate the weirdness from time to time, but always try to, pull back and say, but I don't know if that proves anything, let alone confirms all the things I want to believe. Now, the last thing I think I'll mention, guys, because I know we're running a little long here, but when it comes to the whole ghost thing, I'm intrigued by the idea of physics, entropy, right? And again, what Stephen Hawking wrote about in A Brief History of Time, the idea of the thermodynamic arrow of time. Really simple way to talk about this is, Caleb, what's going to happen 2 minutes from now?
I'm going to fart.
Okay, well, he probably really does know that. That's true. But most people don't know what's going to happen in the future. And yet I can remember Caleb telling me a few seconds ago that he plans to fart, I think is what he really said.
I don't feel that there's one coming, but I'm not ruling it out either.
Yeah, exactly. So I can remember having that conversation. And the reason why is because human memory works, in the same, it is beholden to the same entropic forces, right, that govern all things. When we talk about Humpty Dumpty, there's a reason why all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, because when the egg breaks, entropy's a bitch.
That, and they didn't like Humpty Dumpty, so they were like, hey, screw you, pal.
Well, you take an egg, drop it on the floor. Now reassemble that egg and put it back together how it looked before.
You can't put the toothpaste back in the toothpaste tube.
This is a unique phenomenon in physics, and there's actually a paradox between, the laws of thermodynamics and the laws of conservation of energy, but we won't get into all that right now. But again, what Hawking is describing is that there's a thermodynamic, an entropic arrow of time where some things go one way and they don't go the other.
Well, it's actually really funny that you bring that up, because when I start thinking about this idea of ghostly phenomenon, I mean, we've covered everything. Like, I know that this episode is focused on ghosts, and I think that even though we've talked about a lot of different concepts, that they all certainly echo kind of back to the overarching idea of maybe all of these things in tandem in different lines of thought can help to explain what people are experiencing as ghostly phenomenon. But I tend to think about this whole idea of the law of thermodynamics, our understanding of entropy, gravity, which is, there are still some questions out there in
Definitely.
regards to gravity, which I think is really interesting. I think it's time that we talk to, well, maybe a ghost from the future, because our perception of time may just be linear to us, but that might not be what it's doing. Now, is there not a model of the universe that essentially looks like a donut that is just kind of folding in on itself, or going outwards, and that energy is always dispersing? What if the afterlife is life?
Or future life.
Well, that's what I'm saying. What if the afterlife is life? What if there is no in-between realm? We go out of one vessel and we go directly into another one. Now, that is potential. I don't know if the timeline really works out that well, or how long you're in the waiting room, but maybe there's a limbo. But all that being said, now I don't understand a shit ton about science. I wasn't the best in school, but I am incredibly fascinated by it, and when I want to know stuff about that, I tend to look towards other places. And one of the great tools of recent times, well, it is the little tiny baby AI.
Singu baby.
The singularity baby. And so I thought, I've had some very interesting conversations with ChatGPT, and ChatGPT has, it's good in some things, it's not so good in others. But I think it's really interesting and of note to be able to kind of look at some of the perspective in which it has. So when we were talking about working on this episode, I started thinking about this whole thing of like really trying to imply scientific thinking towards the idea of ghostly phenomenon. So I started out with this. This is the first question that I asked it. Based on your understanding of the law of thermodynamics, entropy, magnetism, electricity, and perception in general, what would you conclude that ghosts more than likely are? And I said, keep in mind that there have been claims that ghosts can potentially, and maybe I'm leading the witness a little bit, but I wanted to see what it was going to say to this. There have been reports or claims that ghosts can harm people, interact with people, sometimes seem to not acknowledge people at all, be able to disappear, sometimes give prophetic warnings, telling people of events that haven't taken place yet.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it had said, This is a profound and multifaceted question, and one that blends physics, psychology, and metaphysical speculation. While no current scientific theory fully explains ghosts, we can explore this topic using known laws of thermodynamics, electromagnetism, quantum physics, cognitive science, and anomalous perception to offer the most plausible frameworks, while keeping in mind that these are speculative and not conclusive. Now, I'm only going to give a couple of instances here because I go on to another question that I thought was pretty interesting as well. So first off, it gives me thermodynamics and entropy. Do ghosts violate physical laws? The first law of thermodynamics, conservation of energy, tells us that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. Some ghost theories speculate that consciousness is a form of energy that could persist after death. However, no mechanism is known by which the human mind or consciousness could become free-floating energy, quote, and remain organized in a way that retains memory, intention, or agency after bodily death. Entropy, the second law, suggests all energy systems naturally decay into disorder, meaning a coherent, self-aware ghost would run counter to natural entropy unless sustained by an external source. Conclusion: ghosts as persistent energy forms would seem to violate entropy unless a medium exists we don't understand. It goes on to essentially give a little bit more insight into electromagnetism, specifically electricity in apparitions, which, when we look at the use of ghost meters and electromagnetic field detectors, I thought that was kind of an interesting one because this is the main tool in a paranormal investigator's tool belt. And it went on to say, there are claims of lights flickering, electronic malfunctions, or even burns and physical harm attributed to spirits. But electrical malfunctions are also common in older or overloaded systems, especially during stress, storms, or environmental changes. However, if such anomalies occur in tandem with intelligent-seeming behavior, meaning apparitions reacting to observers, speaking, or giving prophetic messages, that points to something beyond pure physics. So it's having a little bit of trouble trying to really relate these things. So I was like, okay, now you're trying to relate this to our understanding of all of the principles that we previously stated. So I said, thanks so much, because people, thank your AIs.
Be nice to them now.
Be nice to them now. I said, thanks so much. If you were to go outside our known understanding of science, but extrapolate based upon that as to how the existence of ghosts could be actually manifesting or exist, could you tell me how you think they could exist and be manifesting? And it essentially said the hypothesis as far as consciousness as a non-local field goes. It said, consciousness isn't separated by the brain, but channeled through it, potentially. Like a radio receiving a signal. I've heard people talk about theories very similar to this many, many a time. When the body dies, the signal persists in the field of space-time. How ghosts could manifest. Residual, quote-unquote, imprints of consciousness could persist where emotional energy was intense. Battlefield homes, hospitals. I do question sometimes if it is pulling from, different theories that are already put out there, more than likely so.
Surely is, of course.
All of its framework is built on things that it's been fed.
Yeah.
Under specific environmental conditions, EM field strength, humidity, geomagnetic flux, these consciousness residues might partially couple back to the physical world, producing apparitions, audible manifestations, and so forth. When it gets into quantum information echo hypothesis is what it calls this. When consciousness collapses quantum states, it leaves behind information entanglement patterns in the environment. Similar to ghost data, under the right resonance, these patterns replay.
Man, this sounds almost identical to stone tape theory.
Yeah. Oh,
now that
100%.
we're reading it.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Just as a laser can reconstruct a hologram from stored interference patterns, environmental fields, EM, radiation, geomagnetic changes, brain activity could, quote-unquote, read residual quantum information left behind by humans. The result, brief holographic-like projections of people and or events. Scientific parallels. Quantum decoherence timescales vary. Information is never destroyed per unitarity. Sorry, these are words I don't see a lot.
Well, I think
unitarity in quantum mechanics. I mean, he goes on to say some other kind of interesting things.
You ever hear the expression, energy can neither be created nor destroyed?
Oh, yeah.
There was a huge paradox a few years ago, and Susskind and the late Stephen Hawking, fought about this, because Hawking for a time was saying that technically, if matter were to enter a black hole, that, technically the matter might actually be destroyed, or that information could actually be destroyed. And he was able to reconcile this, and even though other people had suggested how he might do this, and later Susskind was kind of like, well, I tried to tell him that, but Hawking, of course, took credit for it. So he'd figured out the mystery behind this, and Susskind and his colleagues had been trying to, tell him all along, here, dude, this is what's going on. Anyway, the point was, even Hawking at one time thought there might have been a physical, paradox, and there wasn't really. And indeed, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Well, information apparently is the same way. So in short, really kind of what we're getting at is the notion that, information after a person dies, the matter doesn't cease to exist. We are but dust, and to dust we returneth. So the person returns to the earth and the physical body breaks down. Well, what about the information that is created? Right? I'm talking about here the consciousness imprint. Now, again, a physicist might say, but that's not the same thing as information in the sense that Hawking and physicists mean it. And I get that. But I'm speculating generally, is it possible that there is some kind of, consciousness matrix residuum that can be in whatever that medium is that, the singularity baby was talking about? I like that you called it a ghost from the future, and I'll tell you why here in a moment. I mean, even if we don't know what that medium is, if the medium is something that occurs, in a quantum state or whatever, is the information preserved? And can the information that we preserve in our minds, right, beholden to entropy as living things as it is, can it somehow persist after the fact? Again, the idea here is simply that there's something we haven't figured out yet.
Oh, sure.
That could facilitate all this stuff, and one day it won't be all that mysterious.
Well, you're touching on some stuff that the singularity baby is too, and this is the one last thing I wanted to get into, because you hear a lot recently in the circles of ufology talking about, well, there's a good chance that whatever this phenomenon is that we're experiencing is potentially interdimensional. Which is why I thought it was kind of interesting. You're talking about different fingers of the same glove for a lot of these phenomena to potentially be very interactive in the same realms and or potentially part of the whole big thing. I found this part very interesting. Interdimensional or phase shift hypothesis. Ghosts are entities or consciousness fields existing in a neighboring dimension or brain, spelled Brane. Yeah. And I said, well, I don't see brain spelled like that very much. So,
like brain theory. Yeah.
Well, sure. But I Googled it because, what is this? A brain, a physical object that generalizes the notion of a zero-dimensional point particle, a one-dimensional string, or a two-dimensional membrane. So it's essentially talking about, and this kind of drums up in my mind these ideas of, well, could the collective consciousness kind of be, if we were to model it out, could it look like one of these things that, Singularity Baby here is talking about? And it says, normally phase shifted out of perception. Occasionally, dimensional overlap allows limited visibility or interaction. Now, that really caught my attention because I'm thinking, well, that sounds exactly like what a lot of hauntings, at least behaviorally, tend to manifest as. It also is this thing to me where it's like I've heard so many stories about where entity phase shifts into existence in front of somebody, is able to physically interact with them, knows who they are, speaks to them directly, and then disappears, as juxtaposed to the idea of an energy imprint of an apparition that we just see on a time loop. This is clearly something different, at least from the reports of what this person has experienced. It goes on to say how ghosts could manifest. When local space-time geometry fluctuates, electrical storms, magnetic anomalies, high emotion, the quote-unquote frequency of dimensional phase between worlds temporarily aligns. Now, somebody out there that knows more about models of interdimensional shit, please hit us up and tell us if any of this makes sense to you. Beings or imprints from the adjacent dimensions partially phase into ours, appearing translucent, then fading out. Physical effects, scratches, pushes, could arise when the two realities briefly overlap enough for energies to exchange. You know, it's not going into a ton of scientific detail, but I like where its head is at. And then scientific parallels, M theory, 11-dimensional brains, hypothesis of thin spots in space-time, apparently the Einstein-Rosen bridges, quantum tunneling regions, electromagnetic resonance conditions, Schumann resonance might modulate the perceptual veil. Now, again, I don't know a lot about science. That's why I have to go to external sources to try to put these things together, to ask these questions, to look into these things. However, I have thought for a very long time, just on the fly, my general perception of reality and looking at the cases that have been presented to me. For a long time, I've thought, this sounds interdimensional. Ghostly phenomenon in a lot of instances, and I don't know what interdimensional is. I've heard theories that I cannot parrot back to you right now that have made sense to me when I've heard them. But these phenomena inherently, to me, if these people are to be believed, sounds kind of interdimensional. It's not the thing that I'm sitting here going, this is it, guys. This is what I believe. We've cracked the code. No. What I'm saying is, let's keep looking at these consistencies. Let's keep looking at cases where people are saying the same things are happening. But the nature of this, I do feel like we could apply a hell of a lot more science to it. But the scientific community doesn't seem to want to do that, which is fine. But I do know that there's a lot of scientifically minded people out there that do want to look into this stuff and have no problem applying a little bit of science to it. So, hey, if you're out there and you know a shit ton about quantum physics and you're not Travis Taylor, although he probably would talk to us anytime about this stuff, and I'd actually love to hear what he'd have to say. I would love to hear anybody's take on this because I love the concept of applying science to what we are going to blanket statement consider the paranormal.
Yeah. I would also say that when it comes to ghosts, let's say that Fred from the 8th dimension somehow phases into ours, and Fred's actually just a dude. But if he phases into our reality because of some strange speculations that ChatGPT was talking about in those instances, and again, what ChatGPT is talking about, M-brain theory and, all these different ideas, basically just, interpretations of dimensionality and also the potential relationship between phenomena that is, we're on the cusp of understanding, and we have some good understanding of it, and we have quite a body of knowledge, but there's still a lot of aspects of it that are mysterious, like, for instance, quantum phenomena, the breakdown between, Newtonian physics and the quantum realm, how we try to reconcile theories of gravity, how we try to reconcile observations of the universe in the absence of being able to find dark energy and dark matter, but still being able to measure their influence.
Sure. If
they exist. And I'll go ahead and say if they exist. A lot of scientists don't want to hear that, but there are many others who are actually like, it could also be, however, that something about our math is a little wrong and that we're using nice placeholder concepts to fill in the blanks for something that we really actually had the math wrong to begin with. So all these things that we're describing, and again, ChatGPT was kind of drawing from all these different areas where it seemed applicable and then speculating about these things. Those kind of things, we're still trying to figure out a lot of this stuff. And it could be that somewhere in the lattice of the mysterious aspects of those phenomena, dimensionality, quantum mechanics, and all that the answers to what we call ghostly phenomena exist. And it may not all be one thing. Fred from the 8th dimension, as I was discussing, let's say he phase shifts into ours for a second. We see a person, what appears to be a person, manifest for a second, and they're looking around, and then he vanishes. Most people are going to see that, and they're going to go, by Jove, I just saw a ghost.
Yeah.
Because our frame of reference, we don't know where Fred's from or that he could come from the 8th dimension, let alone that an 8th dimension exists in which Fred occupies normally.
And because we perceive time linearly, we have a propensity to think that it's somebody from the past.
Well, that's the thing. So coming back to that whole idea about like the thermodynamic arrow of time, my question was going to be for you, have you ever seen a ghost from the future? And Caleb was like, yeah, watch this. I'm going to think of that before you bring it up, and I'm going to talk with one. So, and of course I would say, yeah, we generally don't see ghosts from the future unless the ghosts from the future are UFOs. And that's what, the phenomena we call ghosts, whatever it is, if we look at it the other direction, maybe it's how UFOs manifest. I don't know. funny thing about that, I had a chapter in my book, The UFO Singularity, about that. And I was talking with Eric Von Daniken years ago, and he says the original title of his book, Chariots of the Gods, before he came to the United States and it was published under that name, the original title, he said, was Ghosts from the Future.
Wow. Oh, shit. I had no idea that.
Yeah, so that brings it kind of full circle back to weirdness and UFOs and everything.
Damn, dude.
But that all said, we don't really see ghosts from the future. But if we did, how would we perceive that? And again, I would suspect that the reason that ghosts are things we associate with the past is because, again, it has something to do with the entropic environment. I'm not saying that they're related to entropy. In fact, Chat would have seemed to have said, entropy seems to suggest ghosts can't exist. But again, I would counter and say entropy and the laws of thermodynamics suggest ghosts can't exist. And physics, and physicists say this all the time, predicated upon the presumption that ghosts are non-corporeal, apparitional forms that exist apart from the now dead body of a deceased individual. But if we're wrong about that's what ghosts are, and that's not what they really are.
And they're completely physical manifestations that could potentially be phase shifting into another physical reality and therefore able to react.
Or something else completely separate. But the point stands, that or whatever else, if it's something completely other than what our cultural anthropological attitudes toward spirits, ghosts, the afterlife, etc., have led us to believe these phenomena are, and therefore what we observe. Again, the analogy of Fred from the Eighth Dimension is to illustrate we would be easily very misled by our biases when we see what appears to be a translucent human that we can see smack through, and he phase shifts into the room with us and looks real weird for a second, then vanishes. We'd all go, ghost! Remember Dr. Manhattan? Sure. When Dr. Manhattan was reassembling himself in Watchmen, they said that the laboratory was haunted, and people were saying that they were seeing a ghost. First, it was just bones walking around, and then they said it had a nervous system, and it was pretty creepy. It was actually just John Osterman reassembling himself after the accident and becoming Dr. Manhattan. But right. they literally referred to him as, they said the laboratory's haunted because John died in the particle accelerator, and now his ghost is haunting the lab. That's not quite what was going on, but they perceived it like that for a while.
Yeah, and obviously, if you see an apparition of somebody that has died, well, that's a different thing. You know?
Completely, yeah. But this is why I love Stephen Hawking and Leonard Susskind and reading these physicists, who would tell you ghosts don't exist. And yet they very, very well may be the people that if I sat down, if I could speak to the late Stephen Hawking, which I would love to have done. I've read his books for years. If I could sit down, Leonard Susskind's still alive, but he's very famous. But if I could sit down with one of these physicists and say, but what if? And I tried that, Caleb, at the SCU conference with Kevin Knuth.
Nice.
He has a journal, Entropy, and he actually, not just UFOs, he covers a lot of issues in physics. And so I kind of broached this topic, and I said, what if, some of these phenomena that we would call ghosts are somehow related to entropy? And he said, nope, that's not it. He says, trust me, I've thought about this a lot. That's not it. But I think what he was saying is what ChatGPT was saying.
Sure.
Entropy and the laws of thermodynamics do not allow for those things to exist. What I am saying, on the other hand, is that something about human perception and the fact that ghosts appear to be apparitional forms of people who once existed, i.e. in the past. We remember the past. We can't see the future. Where are the ghosts from the future? Fred from the Eighth Dimension. We don't see those things because entropy limits our perception of those things. But not the past. I can remember Caleb saying he was going to fart and he lied because he didn't.
You don't know.
Little do we know.
See? So the ghost from the past, the people, the apparitional forms from the past, that at least is in keeping with the way memory works in accordance with entropy. That's what I'm saying.
Well, let me just tell you that there's a ghost from the past that you hear at the beginning of every single episode.
Oh, I thought he was going to fart. I was waiting on it. Ghost of a bean.
Well, look, it was a speculative fart. There's a ghost from the past that you hear at the beginning of every single episode, and he tells you that there's ghosts in the mountains. Well, let me tell you what. I might not know what a ghost is, and that is always the ongoing question. A question that I'm excited we still get to ask, because if we figured everything out, things would get very boring very fast. But there is still some mystery. Austin, some of the stuff that you and I uncovered and talked about during spooky season still has me scratching my head, dude.
Oh, for sure.
And I'm just going to tell you, I'm glad that everybody sticks around and listens to this podcast because I do think there's ghosts in the mountains. I don't know what the hell those are, but I'm glad that we get to sit down with people like Micah and have these in-depth discussions and really go into the weeds with some of these just crazy phenomenon that we can at least if they're not exactly ghostly phenomenon as it is classically reported, it has got to be adjacent to that.
Yeah, and I hope if nothing else, this episode has almost expanded people's perspective on this. If you thought that ghosts were just a black and white, it's a being, a dead entity in the afterlife or nothing. I hope it gives you another context to consider what this might actually be or where it's coming from.
Oh, certainly. And for my final part here, I'll just also say, talking about there being ghosts in the mountains, I wrote this on the plane on my way in here. I said, do the ghosts of the dead haunt the living? Yes, they do. They haunt us every time we observe the picture of a lost loved one and are reminded that the fates remove some of us from this world far earlier than their expected time. And one of my other things I even talked to Caleb about before we did this episode, things we might discuss, he picked ghosts. I'd said, we could also do missing persons cases. I'm very haunted. I'm a very haunted person. I've studied the disappearances of people in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and in other places. And when you study that stuff and these children who vanish, whatever it was that happened to them, presumably they're no longer with us. And yes, in that regard, I'm a very haunted person, and I can assure you there are ghosts in those mountains.
You heard it here first, people and Wikipedia. But hey, I just want to thank every single one of you for sticking around and listening to our crazy podcast. I'd like to thank everybody that subscribes to us on Patreon and supports the channel, and we hope that you enjoyed what we put together for you for Halloween. A little punk rock tune that me and Austin threw together. And hey, if you want to go find out what that is, you can subscribe to us on Patreon. You can go to ghostsinthemountains.com to find that link. Feel free to subscribe. You get access to an ad-free version of the podcast. But we want to send out a huge thank you to everybody that keeps writing in. I promise one day we're going to get around to all of the emails, but it is a lot, and it's awesome that you're writing in, and we love hearing about your experiences. It's been incredible reading those. Want to thank Micah Hanks so very much for coming in here. He's been busy. He's been flying all damn day, but he's, been giving us a generous portion of his time to come in here and talk about this stuff. Micah, your insights into every aspect of the weird, the strange, the unexplained is always appreciated here at Ghosts in the Mountains, brother. Thank you.
Thank you.
Austin, get out of here. No, I'm just kidding. I love you, brother. I'm excited about everything in the future, and, thank you so much for everything you do for this show. And thank you guys for letting me tell a bunch of fart jokes. It's good for my soul. Soul with an S. So, love you guys. Thank you all so much, as always. And we're going to catch you guys on the next episode of Ghosts in the Mountains. Oh, hey, and Micah said he knows this guy that's got this real weird story. We're going to try to do one about that in the future.
Maybe another 10 episodes or so,
Stay tuned. It's coming, and it's really, really odd. You all take care and stay spooky, everybody. Micah, you were talking about Humpty Dumpty.
I always talk about Humpty Dumpty.
You know how back in the day, if you were a baker, your last name was Baker? What did Humpty Dumpty do? All right.
Yeah.
There's your Keister egg, everybody. Good night. Humpty Dumpty was a weirdo.